Boy, I miss Terence McKenna. I wonder what he would have to say about what's going on in the world today. And he was a great mentor and a great friend, and I still love listening to his wonderful lectures. And yeah, people encounter that some of the same beings, not only in in DMT experiences and mushroom experiences, but also in dreams, and especially in lucid dreams, when people are conscious and awake in their dreams and communicate with the different beings. Many people describe also the alien abduction phenomena and the UFO contactee experience. Many of the same beings that we described in our recent book. The gray alien, the praying mantis entities, the octopus-like beings, and he believes that within about 4 years we're going to have what's called artificial general intelligence, which means that artificial intelligence will be equal to any expert human in any field, and be able to do pretty much anything that a human being can do. And this trajectory is going to keep accelerating, where artificial intelligence will keep improving itself. It'll develop better and better models, so that it becomes more and more intelligent. And he sees this kind of culminating in a period around 2043. Where artificial intelligence not only becomes as smart as any human being, or as smart as all human beings, but smarter than all human beings combined, and smarter than the collective intelligence of human beings. And he refers to this as the singularity. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that our expectations play an incredible role in what we actually experience as reality. I think that reality is kind of a quantum flux, of possibility, and that our belief systems, play a very important role in how reality actually forms. And it's not just a metaphor; that there really is, physical consequences to our thoughts.
All right. So, David, welcome to Truth Theory Podcast. Greetings from Europe. Are you in California currently?
Yeah, I'm in Northern California by Santa Cruz, a little bit south of San Francisco. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today, Mike.
Well, thank you for joining me, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you, because you've been a prominent figure in the psychedelic space. And for me, this whole, the whole idea of psychedelics, using psychedelics for healing or for growth, it's one of the more important topics in my life. In fact, it happens sometimes that I actually do even some talks and lectures on the topic of neo-shamanism and using psychedelics for kind of mind-expanding purposes or spiritual purposes. And there are a lot of topics that you focus on which are really interesting to me. So, I think we can straight away jump into some of these topics, because, a lot of people, I think, are already familiar with some of your background. So, one of your works talks about, I think it's one of your most recent books, talks about psychedelics versus, technological singularity. So we often, when we use psychoactive plants, we often feel this connection with nature, or as like this feeling of that everything is interconnected, everything is one. And currently what's happening in the world is that we are moving into this, new territory where we're being told maybe we're gonna get upgraded with some kind of technologies, transhumanism. People like Ray Kurzweil talk about technological singularity coming within 20 years. That's going to change everything about humanity. And a lot of these futurists and researchers claim that, everything's going to shift. And I think a lot of average people, they don't fully understand or comprehend where this is heading and how profound this is. And you think that, psychedelics can help us to maybe, I don't know, just to understand it better or stay away from it or not get into some kind of technological trap. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it. And for those of, because this is in one of your works as well. So maybe you could summarize it.
Yeah, I'll do the best I can. This is my latest book, one of my latest books, which is Psychedelics and the Coming Singularity. And I interviewed a number of prominent thinkers, and I've interviewed Ray Kurzweil in the past about the role. My cat's, I think, going to join us a little bit here. And I've been very interested. I do think that it's very important when most people do psychedelics that they do it in a certain setting that involves a lot of immersion in nature. I think that the interconnection with nature is extremely important. But there has been a connection between psychedelics and technology from pretty much the beginning. The Silicon Valley, which is near where I live, it's very close to the San Francisco Bay Area, and there was a lot of people from the psychedelic community who were involved also in programming and computer development. Steve Jobs, as you probably know, said that the person who developed the Apple computer said that LSD was one of the 5 most important things that he did in his life. And many people who have been involved in artificial intelligence and the development of the internet were also people who had a lot of experience with psychedelics. So there is kind of this long connection. And what I explored in my book really was, you mentioned it in your introduction, was that Ray Kurzweil believes he's an expert at being able to predict the development of technology, especially artificial intelligence. And he predicted back in the 1990s that artificial intelligence was going to exponentially increase in its computational power, and that by the time we were in the 2020s, we would have what we have now is the large language models, like ChatGPT, and many people were skeptical of this for years, and many people were astonished that he was pretty much right on track, and he believes that within about 4 years we're going to have what's called artificial general intelligence, which means that artificial intelligence will be equal to any expert human in any field, and be able to do pretty much anything that a human being can do. And this trajectory is going to keep accelerating, where artificial intelligence will keep improving itself. It'll develop better and better models, so that it becomes more and more intelligent. And he sees this kind of culminating in a period around 2043, where artificial intelligence not only becomes as smart as any human being, or as smart as all human beings, but smarter than all human beings combined, and smarter than the collective intelligence of human beings. And he refers to this as the singularity, which is a term that was borrowed from astrophysics. And astrophysics, it basically means the point where physics breaks down, where we can't make any predictions about the future, such as what happened before the Big Bang, or what lies in the center of a black hole. And so he applied this to technology, and we can't really imagine what's going to happen after an intelligence on our planet becomes smarter than all human beings combined. And I see the relationship between psychedelics and the singularities being tremendously important, because what psychedelics do, I think, more than anything else, I mean, they can help people with getting over traumas from their childhood. They can help people with creativity. There's so many wonderful things, as that psychedelics psychedelics can do. But I think the single most important thing that they're doing is they're helping to raise ecological awareness on the planet. They're helping to connect people to the environment. They're helping to make people, acutely aware of the danger that we're facing, in a climate crisis right now. And what's more important than our connection to nature at this time? And many people in the ecology movement started out were inspired by their experience with psychedelics. So I see these two things as dovetailing. Our movement towards this artificial intelligence that's going to have greater abilities than all human beings combined. And at the same time we have to balance that with human beings who are aware of the climate crisis and who are taking steps to try to reverse the problem, because if not, we're going to be extinct as a species. I mean, this is going to be the end point. I mean, we have maybe a few decades left, before it gets out of control. So I think these are the two most important factors in the future evolution of the human species, and it's very important that they both be balanced. And I see psychedelics as providing that necessary balance.
Yeah, I think, some people, let me tell you a quick story. One time I was actually doing LSD in the forest and with my cousin and another friend. And I had this feeling when that was like 2017. I had this feeling that the forest or Gaia or Earth, whatever you want to call it, was kind of talking to me. So I was walking through this forest and I'm having these downloads. Look, I give you everything you need. And then I look on the ground and there is a magic mushroom. It's almost like it was guiding me. Look, you see, I give you whatever you need, And then I found in this forest this plastic oil bottle, like from a car engine or something, right? And it just struck me like, wow, we are destroying this beautiful nature, humans with all this fake garbage and synthetic things and all this stuff. And funny enough, my cousin who was with me at that time, when we talked about this trip afterwards, he said he had the same thing. He felt in this forest like the forest was speaking to him and, guiding us through this forest and things like that. And this is something that in all sorts of different ways, people experience this connection with either something, maybe it's the spirit of the earth, maybe it's spirit of the forest. I think even Terence McKenna, I know you knew him, right? You knew Terence, right?
Yeah.
He used to say things that, mushrooms are intelligence from space, or people who, say that ayahuasca has the spirit behind. So there is a lot of, claims that maybe there is consciousness behind Earth or behind nature or whatever. And some people think that sometimes what happens on psychedelics is that we tap into that. And that's why, what we are doing on Earth currently with, this consumerism and capitalistic society and creating synthetic versions of reality with technology, AI, and things like that. When you are on psychedelics, you are actually being kind of shown the other side through all sorts of ways. Sometimes could be downloads, sometimes could be just realizations, maybe whatever. Do you think? What do you think? Do you think that people really tap into some kind of higher mind or Gaia or spirit of the plant or whatever? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've thought about that question quite a bit. It's especially common with psychedelic plants more than with LSD or synthetic psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca. People often claim that there's a voice that speaks to them, either the voice of nature, the voice of the intelligence of the mushroom. Some people claim, or the intelligence, the ayahuasca spirit. When I was down in Peru, I had experiences with ayahuasca where there was definitely a a voice or an intelligence that was communicating with me. Sometimes it would be a voice. Sometimes it would communicate to me with the imagery that I was shown. It was almost like dream imagery. There was a symbolic nature to it that you were able to sort of, had a personal meaning that you were able to decode. And it seems like the most common message that people get from mushrooms or from ayahuasca is the climate crisis, as I mentioned, and why it raises ecological awareness. Whether there's an actual intelligence in the plant or the fungus itself, or whether you're tapping into the greater, Mother Nature is the other. The Gaia hypothesis is a scientific theory that was proposed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margolis, years ago, where they saw the whole planet Earth as, the biosphere of the Earth as being a kind of mega organism, a kind of giant organism that regulates, the atmospheres and the oceans together the same way we regulate, the blood systems and our, the organ systems in our own body, but just on a very large scale. And he just saw this as basically a large organism. But people like Terence McKenna and other people who have been in the psychedelic community, point out that it's not just an organism; it's an intelligent organism, and it's one that you can actually have communication with, which is what many people claim. I've certainly had that experience as well, and for me, it's been very profound. It's one of the things that I explore in my latest book, which is the illustrated field guide to DMT entities, and in this book, we explore the different beings and entities and intelligences that people report contact with when they're having these psychedelic experiences. What do I personally believe? I mean, it's a great mystery. I mean, whether I think that I'm communicating with just a higher part of my own mind, my own DNA, the plant spirits, beings that are in hyperspace, or the intelligence of the planet. I mean, these are all different possibilities that I don't know. I try not to, believe any one of them too strongly, but it certainly feels like there's an interconnection between us and between nature, and that we can tap into that, and that there's a great intelligence that's trying to guide us right now, so we don't destroy ourselves in the biosphere.
Yeah, and this is actually another really interesting topic: the DMT entities, or entities in general that people encounter during psychedelic states. And always, the question is always, I think, are these beings real, or are they just hallucinations, right? So skeptics say, they're just, visions or hallucinations or whatever. Some people might speculate that, there are why people see the same beings or the same types of beings. Maybe because they're archetypes, so they just repeat over the centuries or whatever. But I think, from some of my experiences and some of the experiences of other people, I think there is strong evidence that actually these are real beings that occupy their own dimensions or densities or whatever you're going to call it. And I want to give you some examples here. I'm just curious to hear what you think about that. So, for example, like one time, I was doing this session with mushrooms. That was like 3 years ago, sometime, and it was, for most of the session, I had this one entity that was female, and she was humanoid. And she was communicating to me, and basically answering my questions in forms of visions, and also explaining me about my life, a lot about my past lives, showing me scenes, and so she seemed to know me really well. And I could feel her, I could feel her presence, personality. She was very kind, very loving. Like, she knew a lot of my personal details about my relationships and things like that. So I felt like maybe she's one of my spirit guides or something like that. And what happened at the end of this session, so I was blown away completely because, I had this session, and my cousin who was with me, he was really tired, and he was like laying in grass somewhere. This was like mountains, summer, middle of summer. And I forgot that, I drank all the water. We went for a hike, and basically I was so blown away that I would just pick a bottle of water, have a sip, throw it, and just keep like communicating. And at the end of the trip, like it was already fading, and we were starting to pack, and we decided to walk towards the hotel, which was like maybe 1 hour hike down the mountain. The moment we decided to go, my cousin, I didn't pay attention what he was doing. He says, "Oh, I'm feeling weak. I think I'm gonna pass out," because he was dehydrated, and I drank all the water, and it was hot in the summer. So suddenly, when we are about to go, he tells me like he cannot go, and he says, "Leave me here, go get some water and come back," something like this. And the moment he said that, I get this vision showing me, remember about the dream you had from 2 days before. So before the session, 2 days before, where I didn't even know where I gonna do the session. I was like booking the hotel, this mountain, this place, whatever. I had a dream, and in the dream I was shown this situation. So I had this precognitive dream before the session, like 2 days before, where I was shown that me and my cousin gonna split on top of the mountain, and then basically like I'm not gonna be able to find him. He's not gonna return to the hotel, things like that, right? And and exactly this situation appeared at the end of the session, where suddenly he says, "Leave me and go get some water and come back." And that was what I was warned about before the session 2 days ago. So how is that possible, that I can know exactly what's gonna happen before? So when this happened, I straight away understood, okay, I was warned about this situation. Let me so what we decided to do, instead of like leaving him to get some water, we started doing breathwork exercises, like Wim Hof type breathing and things like that. Mm-hmm. He started feeling better, and then we walked back, and we got lost on the way anyway. Like we lost the track. But that's like just one example. Another example, let's say, like Aubrey Marcus. I'm sure you're familiar with him. Aubrey Marcus. I don't know if you know him, but basically he's like a known podcaster, and he talks a lot about psychedelics. Mm-hmm. He was describing one time on Joe Rogan show that he had this dream where some demon appeared in the dream or something. And the demon said something like, whatever, gave the date like 2 months ahead, and said how something's going to happen, like you're going to die or whatever. I don't remember the details. But when Aubrey woke up from the dream, that was just a normal dream, right? He checks his calendar, and he looks at the date that the demon in the dream gave him. And it's the date where he is actually in South America doing ayahuasca ceremony, like maybe 2 months ahead or something like that. Mm-hmm. So when he actually arrived there and he started doing the ceremony, this demon appeared from the dream, 2 months before. So, and try to bribe him and whatever and things like that. So, I personally believe that what's happening really, like we are tapping into real entities, and these anecdotal examples are just examples of like that this is way more than just visions, that these entities can maybe influence us in dreams, not only in, psychedelic sessions, and that they really exist in separate realms. And, as someone who studied a lot of spiritual kind of esoteric movements and things like that, we often talk about densities that correspond with maybe like electromagnetic spectrum, frequencies, perhaps, and things like that. So reality really has different TV channels or different frequencies, whatever. And some of these entities occupy slightly different wavelengths. We occupy lower, and that's what happens when we amplify consciousness with psychedelics. Like the barrier basically is thinner, let's say, and then they can communicate with us and we can communicate with them. And also, you mentioned a lot of people have visions, or they often communicate through some kind of symbolism, visions, insights, downloads, whatever. So we often, even in in ancient Egypt, we heard about the eye of Ra, wherever the third eye, pineal gland, it's depicted in history. A lot of people talk about the fact that maybe, pineal gland, which is supposedly the third eye, is kind of, releasing DMT or something. So there is some connection with that as well, that we have this interface to communicate with these realms or these beings, and they often gonna communicate telepathically through sending us thoughts or visions, whatever. So what do you think about all that? I know it's quite a lot.
Yeah.
But in general, do you think these beings are real, or just some archetypes or imaginative figures or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, thanks for sharing your experiences. Certainly, it seems like most people who have contact with these types of entities describe them as being more real than real. And as you mentioned in your accounts, they seem to certainly know us not only well, but they sometimes know us better than we know ourselves, really. And they can give us all kinds of intriguing insights. And yeah, people encounter some of the same beings, not only in DMT experiences and mushroom experiences, but also in dreams, and especially in lucid dreams, when people are conscious and awake in their dreams and communicate with the different beings. Many people describe also the alien abduction phenomena and the UFO contactee experience. Many of the same beings that we described in our recent book. The gray aliens, the praying mantis entities, the octopus-like beings. Many of these beings appear in both the alien abduction phenomena and in psychedelic experiences. So there's this interesting crossover between dreams, abduction experiences, and psychedelic experiences that gives more credence to the idea that there is some kind of independent reality, to these beings, and that they're not just hallucinations. It's one of the questions that I've personally explored. Since I had an experience back in 1983 where my very first DMT experience, where I was pinned down to an operating table, and a giant praying mantis being with my own face was doing some kind of experiments on me, and brain surgery, and seemed to be rewiring and retuning and adjusting my brain in some kind of way that I feel has had a long-term effect. And I wondered about this, almost every day. I think about that experience. And when I did my book, I asked the question. My last two books, actually, I asked the question to many experts like Andrew Gallimore. I've asked Rick Strassman. I've asked the people that were involved in the DMT X research, the extended state research that they're doing at Imperial College right now and elsewhere around the world, where they put people into extended states where people are in DMT, not for experiences, not for 5 or 10 minutes like it normally lasts when you smoke it, but for half an hour or an hour or longer periods, so they can have lengthier discussions with these entities and maybe see if they can bring back some kind of evidence, some kind of communications, technology blueprints, for example, how to make a time machine, how to make how to build a starship, some kind of new energy technology or something. I mean, if we can bring something back like that, it would certainly lead credence to the idea that these entities really have an independent existence. I mean, or are they parts of ourselves, or are they parts of the collective unconscious, like you said? Archetypes. I don't have a really firm belief that any one of these. I entertain all these different possibilities, but my own experience certainly leads me to believe that they're as real as we are. I mean, there really is no scientific measure of consciousness. I mean, how do I know that you're a conscious being? I mean, I'm just assuming it based on, your behavior and based on, the empathy that I'm feeling with you right now. But I really don't know. I have no way to measure your personal consciousness. And, so there's only consciousness that I can be 100% sure of is my own, and I infer it about other people, and I infer it about animals. I also infer it about plants, and I certainly suspect that the DMT entities that we have contact with are also independently conscious beings. But I don't know for sure. I guess if you had to pin me down and say, what do you really believe? I would say that I do think that they all exist in our mind in some sense, but that our mind extends far beyond our brains, that our mind is not just, localized only in our brains, but that our minds extend into other dimensions, and that we're all connected in some kind of hypermind of some kind. So, but it's just a fascinating mystery. There's really no definitive answer. But certainly we're doing this extended state research right now at Imperial College and elsewhere, where people are looking into this, and we may get some very profound evidence. What they're doing is they're now sending people out in teams. They're sending people out together, to have these extended state DMT experiences to see if they can link up and experience some kind of telepathic communication, or some kind of mutual occupation of these higher dimensional spaces.
Yeah, like I think Terence McKenna was talking about the situations when he and Dennis, his brother, could see the same beings, like these mechanic elves, at the same time. So this is always also interesting. Are they having the same type of hallucination, or are they actually tapping into the same thing? And you're talking about research being done on this topic in places like Imperial College and elsewhere. Is it still, what do you think about mainstream scientific community looking at this type of research? Is it are they considering it, or they still kind of laugh at it or whatever? Or is it the studies are not big enough, or the evidence is not conclusive to convince a skeptic? What do you think about skeptical approach to science trying to understand such phenomena?
Yeah, well, my background is in neuroscience. I was a neuroscience researcher at the University of Southern California and at New York University for years. And there, they weren't even, at the time when I was there, they weren't even interested in consciousness, really. You were either conscious or unconscious, and that was as far as they went with with that idea. So mainstream science is, people who have not had psychedelic experiences or who have not had DMT experiences on their own are extremely skeptical of this idea. They generally think that it's that, the word they're still using the term hallucinogen for psychedelics and believe that these are basically hallucinations. There, of course, are some open-minded scientists. The people that are working on this, people like David Luke at Imperial College, are a lot more open-minded. I really think it's a really clear division between people who have had the experience and people who haven't. If you have not had the experience, it sounds just crazy to people that they can take a drug and actually communicate with some kind of being in another dimension. I mean, it sounds completely far-fetched, but once you've actually had the experience, you come back awestruck and you're like, wow, I mean, maybe there really is something to this.
Yeah, this is, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's a very big skeptic when it gets to anything paranormal, let's say.
Yeah.
And he says, oh yeah, your brain can create all sorts of experiences where you have near-death experience and people think they left their body. Oh, this is just your brain doing some kind of tricks. And the problem is, like, until you experience it yourself, you don't really know what you're talking about. Like, I get a lot of skeptics in spiritual community because this is something I'm focusing a lot on. So when I talk about psychedelics for spiritual purposes, let's say, and I always try to highlight dangers as well, like pros and cons and things like that, to not just promote it in one way, I face all sorts of skepticism from these people, and they often say, like, you don't have to do psychedelics to achieve this state of consciousness, whatever, or have these types of experiences, blah, blah, blah. This is a shortcut. It's a dangerous one, blah, blah. And then I learn very often that these people never had even a single experience, or they had one experience that didn't work out well or something like that. So for me, like, you cannot really understand it until you had these experiences. And often this is not just one experience, but maybe several experiences, because once, and this is also the problem with science, sometimes you cannot fully, measure something through some kind of empirical data or experimentation, repetitive experiments, etc., because it's just individual experience that happens within you. So how can I don't have technology to measure the being or verify its identity or dimension, whatever, yet. So that creates a lot of problems. And I think, the only way for these people is to have these experiences first before they start researching and looking into that, because that could help them to maybe convince them first, okay, maybe there's something to it, and then they would be more interested in trying to understand it and look for scientific ways to prove these types of things. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's where I think the division really occurs, is between people who have had the experience and people who haven't. In terms of spirituality and spiritual growth, I certainly think that, a psychedelic is not necessary, to have a spiritual experience, to feel an interconnection with nature and to feel an interconnection with humanity or with divine intelligence. It can certainly, connections can come to us through dreams, through just meditating in nature and things like that. In terms of the pros and cons of psychedelics in this arena. I think that that psychedelics in the right set and setting could unquestionably produce spiritual or mystical experiences that are every bit as real as mystics have claimed since the beginning of history, all the way back to prehistory and shamanism. there's no question they have that ability. In terms of what might be some of the cons is that I guess, some people, they get into a loop where they keep, chasing through psychedelic experiences to trying to recapture that without properly integrating it into their lives, through some kind of spiritual practice, like using meditation or being part of a spiritual community or something like that. So I think it really is important that people, after they've had these types of experiences, that they try to integrate them and they try to work with a group of people that have also had experiences like that and are trying to put their insights into practice in their life.
Yeah, but you mentioned this experience from early 80s where you had this mantis-like being operating on you, and you said something that you felt the impact after the session. So can you tell us more about it? Because I think this could be some kind of danger, let's say, because a lot of people think, okay, if this is just in my mind, why do I feel something afterwards?
Yeah. Well, the experience itself, I didn't really make clear before. It was a terrifying experience. I was incredibly frightened. It was not a fun experience. It wasn't ecstatic or blissful. I was frightened out of my mind, and the experience, whatever this being was doing to me was extremely intense. I felt energies rushing into me and testing me, and synesthesia, and all kinds of really profound, powerful sensations that are hard to put into words, but it was frightening. And when I came out of the experience, my very first thought was, oh yeah, I'm a human being who did a drug. I had completely forgotten who and what I was, and so certainly it's something one has to be tremendously prepared for a situation like that. And in terms of how it affected me afterwards, it's hard to put it into words because it's very subtle. How I felt changed by it. But what it did affect me is that different times in my life, like when I've experienced a profound synchronicity, a profound coincidence, I'll suddenly remember, that experience on DMT. It'll suddenly come back to me, or experience, something about that will occur during, some kind of profound shift in my life or something like that. So it's been kind of something that sort of hides in the back of my mind and then becomes exposed or triggered when I've had different experiences. But I think it also probably, it probably just made me a more conscious being, a more conscious person. It's hard to pin that one particular experience because I've had so many other psychedelic experiences, and I've done DMT several other times, besides that time in 1983, but none was ever as powerful or as profound as that first experience.
Okay, but after this situation, you never had any kind of health problems or some kind of thought patterns or some weird feeling or anything like that? You think it didn't have any impact in this sense?
No, it didn't affect me that way. I have spoken to some people who have reported that there are, it's rare, but it does happen to some people where they have DMT experiences that don't seem to end. Where they keep seeing the imagery and where it can go on instead of for 5 or 10 minutes, it goes on for hours or days. I've heard reports. It is very rare. It's not a common experience, but it's why people with mental health problems, people who might have a family history of schizophrenia or psychosis, really should stay away from these things. I don't think that there's any question that for some people it can be dangerous. I worked in a psychiatric hospital for years when I was in my 20s, and I had a number of people, patients that came in, after or during a psychedelic experience where they had a psychotic break, and most of the time it wore off within 24 hours. But for some people, it triggered a break that can last for months or longer, in susceptible individuals. So this is certainly powerful medicine, and it's not something to mess around with. I really do, recommend that if anybody is interested in experimenting with these things, that they find a good, psychotherapist or psychiatrist or a shaman, somebody who's well versed in these things, to be able to work with them and to not do it without without reading and learning about it, and to do it in a proper setting where they can be guided, and there's less of a opportunity for something to go wrong. But for my, you asked about myself. No, I had no health problems or no psychological problems afterwards, from that DMT experience or from any of my other psychedelic experiences. If anything, I think they've helped to improve my mental health. They've helped me with depression. They've helped me with working through traumas that I had as a child, and different things like that. So in my own case, and in many people who I've spoken with, they can certainly benefit your health. But it's a double-edged sword. It can go either way. I mean, it's a powerful medicine, so it can hurt or heal, and I think the reason for this, my personal theory, is that I'm sure you've heard of the placebo effect, the power of the mind to affect the body. Well, I think what psychedelics do is they amplify the placebo effect. They amplify the power of the mind to affect the body. And so if you're in a setting, in a situation where you're having a positive experience, it can amplify that and can have healing effects. And if you're in in the wrong setting, a setting that where you really shouldn't be doing it outside or with people that you're not feeling comfortable with, then it can amplify those negative feelings, and you make an imprint that lasts with you after the experience is over. So it's very important to do it in a way where you have a proper intention and great respect for these very powerful medicines.
Yeah, their work as amplifiers in certain settings is definitely extremely important part. So you mentioned this experience from the early 80s as one of the most terrifying ones on psychedelics, but what about some of the most enlightening and positive experiences you've had? Because I think I heard you had a lot of experiences, right? You had like how many, hundreds or thousands of sessions on psychedelics?
Probably over 1,000, over 1,000 experiences with LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, DMT. The majority of these occurred when I was much younger. As a teenager, I used to do it quite regularly. One of the most I've had many beautiful, spiritually enlightening experiences. My very first experience with LSD when I was 16 years old was a very profound experience. It started out very frightening. I had done it with a friend, and 2 hours after I did these little purple microdots, I wasn't feeling anything. It was 2 hours had gone by, and my friend went home, and I didn't. I was like, oh, okay, I guess this isn't working, and I actually turned out the light and went to sleep. And as I'm lying there in bed, I closed my eyes, and suddenly I'm seeing these like just crazy wild visions. I'm seeing little Mexican people sticking their heads out from sombreros, and things that just look like fantastical paintings and science fiction scenarios, and I'm like, first I'm thinking this is quite amazing, and I got into this. I had heard that people forget who they are when they're on psychedelics. So I started repeating to myself, my name and my address like it was a mantra, which sounds ridiculous now, right? But at the time, I thought it was a way for me not to forget who I was. But I realized what I was doing was I was desperately trying to hold on to my ego that was just, dissolving, in my young teenage mind, right? And I did start to get scared. I started to become quite frightened, that I was losing my mind and that I was going crazy. And so, I sat there with that for a while, and then what I did was, I put on some music. I listened to the Moody Blues, and I had heard that music is supposed to be a good good therapeutic approach when you're having a difficult time with psychedelics, and within like seconds, it became magical. The music was just exquisite and blissful, and just waves of ecstasy began just undulating through my body, and I just lied there just wiggling, and ecstasy hanging on every note to these songs that were playing in my ear, and reverberating through my whole body, and out outside, and reverberations throughout the room. And I did that for hours, and then right around, I looked out the window and saw the sun was rising, and I went and I went into my backyard and lied out. There was a lawn chair, and I lied out and just looked up at the clouds, and I found myself suddenly in this like state of absolute like divine contentment, where I was able to just every question that I had in my mind, every philosophical question: where did we come from? Where are we going? What is God? What happens when we die? All the great philosophical questions, they would just rise up in my mind. And the moment that they would rise up in my mind, I would immediately get like an answer coming from the clouds, like, my question, answer, just like this back and forth dialogue with some kind of divine, all kind of knowing intelligence. And this went on for, a good hour or two. I just lied there, and the sun's coming up, and, the birds are singing. And I mean, it just couldn't have been more beautiful. And that feeling, of course, persisted for weeks, where I was in this amazing afterglow afterwards. And that was, I don't think I've ever really been the same ever since that first experience. And and then as a result of that experience, I started reading people like Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson, and Ram Dass and Alan Watts, and other people who confirmed the religious nature of the mystical experience that I had.
And you mentioned that you had a lot of experiences at a very early age. I had some, first experiences when I was like 19 or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then the big, profound experiences, which really started my path with psychedelics, was when I was 33. So I feel like, and the experiences from late teens was more kind of like having fun, thinking that everything is a video game, hanging around the neighborhood with some friends and things like that. So what do you think about, like, how they can impact a person, psychedelics, when they're not fully developed, when their brains are maybe not fully developed yet, whatever. I don't know. Like, I feel like some people say that you have to be already mature enough, conscious enough to have these big experiences, because you might have a different types of experience when your brain is not fully developed yet, or whatever. I mean, you have background in neuroscience, right? So what do you think about this? Because do you think it's maybe not so recommended for like young people to have these experiences because of that, like because the fact that they might not have these full-blown spiritual experiences, for example, because they're not developed yet? What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I certainly agree with you that these experiences really are for a mature mind, and that the reports that I've heard from people is that they have their most profound experiences usually later in life, after they're well read, after they're more mature and developed. People like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, they didn't have these experiences until they were in their 40s, really. And people like Aldous Huxley, they were all much older. I do think it can be quite dangerous for an unprepared mind, an unprepared teenage mind, especially to go into these types of experiences. And I think they should really optimally be done with a psychotherapist or with someone who really knows what they're doing. But this may be, I mean, this may not be entirely accurate because other cultures have different ideas. I mean, when I was down in Peru and in the Amazon, I was aware that a lot of people have sort of rite of passage experiences when they're in their early teenage years with ayahuasca. That this is something that that's been long cultural tradition for hundreds of years. That they get that they get introduced to these things when they're basically young teenagers. So but that's done in a community situation where it's where it's highly supported. So it may be very different than people in the Western world doing it, but in general, I certainly think that that people should be mature and prepared and go into these things with great respect.
Yes, like coming to the experience with great respect, I think this is also something that a lot of people don't understand, because I heard many people thinking that it's just the substance, or they say, oh, what if I'm drunk on the party and I gonna do some mushrooms or whatever. Like the substance is one thing, but your intention, your approach, and the settings and the preparation and all these things, they really are half of the whole thing, I would say. Like the substance plus the rest. And the substance in itself is, not enough, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, setting, intention, or a huge part of it. For many years, I always, that was always what I've told people is, setting, dosage and intention are so important. However, when I was down in Peru, one of the things that I added to that when I was having ayahuasca experiences and made contact with Mother Ayahuasca, or the intelligence inside the ayahuasca, was that their intention also plays a role. There's an intention inside the psychedelic that also has a role too that I hadn't taken into account in my own experiences earlier than that.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's really important what kind of shaman you deal with, because you don't really know what are their intentions or who they pray, who they call, whatever. No. And I think a lot of shamans are not a good shamans. That's kind of my perspective. You don't really know who they work with, what kind of entities or beings or whatever. Yeah. Another thing
I personally would be terrified doing it with a shaman who I didn't know well, somebody who I just met that day, or even with a group of people who I just met for the first time. Every time I've had a psychedelic experience, it's always been either by myself or with people who I'm very comfortable with and know very well. It makes you extremely vulnerable. It's more vulnerable than a sexual experience, I think. And, you become completely naked, psychologically with these people, and you are very vulnerable to manipulation. And, and there's an overwhelming number of stories from people who have had negative experiences with shamans down in the Amazon, like you're describing, where they did feel taken advantage of sexually or in other ways. So I certainly think that being extremely comfortable with the people that you do it with is of primary importance.
Also, I wanted to ask you more about microdosing, because, for example, my brother, he had a lot of problems with addictions, with alcohol abuse and, drug abuse and things like that. He had issues with depression and finally ended up, after rehab, on antidepressants, doing them for the last, 3 years nonstop or something. And I think it impacts him in negative ways. He has a lot of periods when he sleeps all the time because he's tired, whatever, all sorts of negative side effects. So I was thinking, are there any more natural alternatives? And I don't know enough about microdosing. I never tried. I know some friends who say, oh, it helps with being more creative, whatever. What do you think about, can microdosing be used to help people who are depressed, for example?
Okay, well, I'm no expert on microdosing, and I really haven't had a lot of personal experience with it. I have been reading this book by James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber, which was just published, which summarizes really what is known about microdosing. Microdosing, for those in your audience who may not be familiar, is when you take a certain a fraction of a recommended of a psychedelic dose of a psychedelic, a dose that's so small that you're not supposed to actually feel it. But it has some kind of beneficial effect anyway. And the beneficial effects, anecdotally at least, have been described as, curing everything from the common cold to helping with, with very, serious medical disorders like multiple sclerosis and the whole spectrum. There's this wide range of reports that people say it helps with. And, as well as with creativity and, with confidence and anxiety and different things. Unfortunately, as far as I know, there's no clinical studies that have been done yet. I think this is something that's really, that's really ripe for study, and that it should be explored and looked into on a scientific level. Years ago, when I was being personally treated for depression by Dr. Oscar Janiger, who is he's one of the psychiatric researchers who was involved in the LSD and creativity research back during the 60s when LSD was legal. And he was also a clinical psychiatrist, and he was a close friend and a mentor, and he treated me for a depressive episode that I had when I was going to graduate school in LA. And I remember him telling me that that he sometimes in underground sessions that they would use low dose LSD, very, very low doses of LSD for people with depression, and that it was for in his practice, and that people did report that it really helped with depression. He said the one main side effect from it was, in his words, I'll quote him, he said, was it gave you a touch of the strange. Was his words, that some people reported that it made things seem a little bit unusual. But we're talking about dosages that that don't interfere with people driving or going through work or doing their normal daily activities. And I would love to see this explored in a scientific manner. The whole microdosing fad or interest or popularity of it now was brought into attention by James Fadiman, the person who co-wrote that book that I just mentioned. And he had a chapter on it in his book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. There was a section on it, and since then it's kind of taken off. I've been kind of surprised at how much popular interest that there's been in it. But as to say whether it really helps with depression or helps with these different medical ailments, I really don't know, and I'd love to see clinical studies, done on it, so we have a better idea. But I certainly think that it's highly possible. I mentioned earlier that I think that psychedelics amplify the placebo effect. So I think on a very small scale, they a very small dose may have a tiny amplification of the power of our own mind to be able to help with things, and that may be why it has such a kind of across the board beneficial effect for so many different ailments, because it amplifies the power of our own minds to to heal our bodies.
And this recent book, what's the title? The one you just showed?
Yeah, it's called Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance It's by James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber. James Fadiman is, by the way, a really old-time psychedelic researcher. He he did a famous study back in the mid, early to mid 1960s when LSD and mescaline and psilocybin were still legal, where he gave mescaline to a group of people that were a group of professionals that were having different professional problems with in different areas. Some were architecture, some were in scientific research, some were artists, different people who were facing some kind of professional problem, and had them work on that problem during their mescaline session, which was all done legally at the time, before psychedelics got banned, and they had tremendous success with being able to come to insights into how to solve these problems. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that psychedelics can be used as a tool for enhancing problem solving abilities and creativity.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, for example, I had all like questions answered during my sessions. Like a lot of you are talking about, oh, can we get some answers to some big questions, like about time machine, whatever. I felt like I had some of these types of answers in forms of visions, downloads. I was being shown, for example, different dimensions or density levels, and I would jump through them, like my consciousness would kind of shift to a different type. And in each one, I would see how the being sees in those dimensions. So, every time I'm going level higher, my senses are expanding and I see like more details and everything is better. And I'm having a review of everything. Oh, these beings, these worlds, these things, then level higher, boom. And again and again and again. I was being also guided and explained what happens in each one. Or, like, for example, another one was my ex, she has abilities to see spirits or entities. And I asked about it. Can I have these types of abilities like she has? And then what happens, I had this vision and I have shown an eye, like if you would deconstruct the eye and being explained like that she sees through higher aspects of electromagnetic spectrum, is like almost like a CGI kind of vision where I have details explained about her senses and things like that. So these types of things, like some things that are absolutely mind-blowing. Like one time I asked about COVID and the vision I received was I was shown 2 DNA strands, different colors. One of them got cut in half, and someone took the DNA from one part to the other and fused it together. And I was being explained it's a, genetically modified thing.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting because I think that the lab leak theory of COVID is the most reasonable explanation to explain its origins. And I the biggest regret that I have in my life is getting a COVID vaccine, because I had a very serious adverse reaction to it that that I'm still dealing with consequences from it today. And I did have a mushroom experience once where I dialogued with the mushroom about the COVID vaccine, and it told me that according to the mushroom spirit, that my body was still producing spike proteins, from the COVID vaccine, and that was why I was still dealing with inflammation issues, and since then there's been confirmation that there was recently a study done at Yale University that showed that that people can still be producing the spike proteins from the vaccine, months and even years, after having received it. So I think that that you can, you really can gain valuable information from these dialogues with the psychedelic entities or the psychedelic intelligences. And, there's a long history of people talking about reports of telepathic experiences and precognitive experiences, not only with psychedelics, but the cross fertilization between psychedelics and dreams is very common. David Luke, I'm sure you probably know, the researcher at Imperial College, has written books about this relationship between psychedelics and psychic phenomena. Stanley Krippner, also a psychologist, parapsychologist, was doing research into this. There was a famous study done back in the 60s that's published in book form. I can't remember the title of it, but all about different psychic experiments that were done under the influence of LSD, where they were trying to visualize, different types of psi reading cards and things like that. And they also got very significant results from that. So this is also something I think that really should be explored scientifically. There's a wonderful psychedelic renaissance going on where they're looking into, how it helps with post-traumatic stress disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder and addiction and other medical ailments. But I'm really looking forward to the day when they can, really explore the relationship between ayahuasca and telepathy, or ayahuasca and precognition, and entity contact and things like that. I think are just, really just waiting to be explored scientifically.
I think one of the roadblocks, let's say, is the attitude of a researcher, because as we discussed, like if the researcher has zero experience himself and he's skeptical, it's kind of hard to really grasp some of the things. And I have this theory that your consciousness and your attitude might define the results you're getting. So for example, like let's say Daniel Pinchbeck, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but he's the author and he talks about psychedelics. I interviewed him a couple of years ago as well. Like he was talking about this experience where he used to explore crop circles in England, and he was staying there for a couple of weeks or months, and some friends would come from US and he wanted to show them interesting crop circles. And he said when the friends who arrived were skeptical, that day when they tried to find some interesting crop circles, they would find like ridiculously bad ones that looked like fakes and all this stuff. But when he had friends who were open-minded and they were interested, they would find some amazing crop circles and things like that. Another example is like I have a friend who is also, he has neuro scientific background, and he runs one of the biggest popular science publications in the world. He's a close friend, and he basically one time I invited him to a big conference which was very alternative, let's say. People like, I don't know, Greg Braden or Joe Dispenza, whatever, like these types of people. And and I wanted to, like, it was like 3 or 4 day event, and I wanted him to come around for at least more than a week and whatever. But somehow what happened, so there are many speakers there, somehow like he only had like 1-2 hours, and he came in the moment out of the whole 4-day conference or something when the speaker looked like lunatic. The speaker was like doing some kind of weird, funny thing on the stage, calling some whatever beings, like, so there were a lot of speakers there who sounded more scientific, who were giving a lot of like evidence, research, whatever. But when he arrived, the only experience he had was like seeing some funny guy doing something weird. So he felt like this whole event is just ridiculous or whatever. It's all about that. So he was kind of laughing and saying to me at the end, like, enjoy the show, and he left. And, and I thought about it like, and he's very skeptical, we have these debates very often. I thought, maybe it's because of his attitude, because this is how he sees things, how he sees this type of research or, topics, whatever. And that's what he always kind of finds or attracts or ends up with, whatever. So I feel like this is really important. If the scientist has this skeptical approach and they are convinced that this is BS, whatever, that's what will reaffirm that to them. Like they will find their evidence to support their bias, whatever, all these things. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that our expectations play an incredible role in what we actually experience as reality. I think that reality is kind of a quantum flux, of possibility, and that our belief systems, play a very important role in how reality actually forms. And it's not just a metaphor; that there really is, physical consequences to our thoughts. I mean, there's a long history of research into psychic phenomena, and it's well known that that many of the scientists who go out setting to prove that psychic phenomena doesn't exist end up proving that, and and scientists who set out to prove that psychic phenomena does exist end up confirming that as well. So their expectations clearly seem to have some kind of actual influence on the results. I wondered about this quite a bit, and I think that's why I think it's so important to try to have positive expectations of what's going on in your life. I've had a lot of experience with lucid dreaming, and and when you're in a lucid dream, when you visualize something happening or imagine something to happen, it happens right away. There's a very little lag time between what happens then. And in a psychedelic experience, we also find that when we imagine or believe something, there's more of a tendency for that to happen, but it happens on kind of a slower or a longer level. There's more lag time between our mind imagining something and it happening. And then, in this waking reality, I feel like there's still, there's very profound influence between our expectations and what we believe about reality and how reality, actually comes to pass. But sometimes there's a greater lag time, because there's a greater density at this level of reality, so that sometimes the connection, most people don't make the connection that it's what they're believing and what they're imagining as to how reality turns out. But I highly suspect that our expectations and our intentions have a much greater influence on reality than most materialist scientists or skeptics are apt to believe. I think people confirm, what they believe most of the time.
Yeah, I think like in quantum physics, we talk about double slit experiment, where the act of observation kind of defines where a particle is. Right. I think what happens is we are shifting to versions of reality that match often like our consciousness level, whatever, expectations or desires and things like that. So in a way, like, if it's hard to talk about objective reality or objective science or things like that completely, and I think this is a big problem for scientific research, that there's gonna be issues to try to prove something like this. Finally, like, before we're gonna finish, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Terence McKenna. One of the things, like, there are two quite interesting topics, I think. I mean, many, but these two I wanted to touch on. Like, one is Timewave Zero theory. So from what I understand, he had some kind of downloads about structure of events in time, which correspond with I Ching, the Chinese divination system. And what do you think about this whole thing? Like, do you think there's some merit to it? Do you think, is there solid evidence? I don't know. How much do you know about it, by the way? Like,
I know a little bit, and I went, I attended a lot of Terence's lectures on the subject. Basically, it's a mathematical model of time that was, downloaded to him when he was down in the Amazon. That has, some kind of strange relationship between the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching and the way that time propagates as a wave through history. You know, I don't know of any scientific evidence for confirming this theory, and Terence himself had different endpoints for it. It was originally supposed to be on his birthday at some point, and then he picked the year 2012, and this endpoint, he basically saw time as a novelty wave. That novelty, the amount of newness that was increasing throughout history and accelerating faster and faster, and that it would reach some kind of point where it was had an infinite density, and we were sort of at the end of history, or the hyperdimensional super object at the end of time. We were going to somehow come in contact with, and people had high hopes that in 2020 that things were going to change, and maybe they did, and maybe we are now living in some kind of alternative timeline as a result of that. But it's even Terence himself was kind of playful about the idea. He would look for evidence, with historical events, and see if they happened during peaks, on this wave, to see if they correlated, with the amount of newness or novelty. And I asked his brother Dennis McKenna about this, and I asked him if he noticed if there was any spike in the time wave during, say, 9/11, which was a historical moment here in America, and different things. And he said he didn't notice anything, or at least he wasn't aware of anything to confirm that theory. But he said that there was a very interesting mathematical correlation between whatever he developed and the I Ching, and that he discovered some type of new pattern in the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. For those who are interested, I don't know the details of that, but he talks about it in his book. I think it's the Brotherhood of the Eternal Abyss, I think is the name of his biography that he wrote about his relationship with Terence, and he discusses the time wave model in that. But my personal theory is, I take it all with a grain of salt. What I love about Terence was not that he was such a brilliant scientist, but that he was such an amazingly brilliant storyteller. He was just mesmerizing to listen to, and it was hard to not listen to him and not hang on every word and be astonished by what he was saying. And his theories about the Timewave Zero, or about the stoned ape theory. Maybe. They're possible. There are possibilities. I don't know that that there's ever going to be an easy way to ever confirm or disconfirm them. So I don't know, as scientific theories, how well they stand up. But on a poetic level, I think that they're beautiful, and that they're mesmerizing. And boy, I miss Terence McKenna. I wonder what he would have to say about what's going on in the world today. And he was a great mentor and a great friend, and I still love listening to his wonderful lectures.
And how did you guys meet?
How did I first meet Terence? I met Terence by attending his workshops at Esalen, the Esalen Institute. He used to in Big Sur. He used to give regular workshops there. I started attending those. I went to almost all of his workshops, and I got to hang out with him up in Occidental, where he lived, and I got stoned with him a number of times there and in Big Sur. And the very the very first interview that I ever did for my book, Mavericks of the Mind, was with Terence McKenna. He was the first person I interviewed when I was in my mid-20s. My partner Rebecca McClennovic and I showed up at the big house and at the Esalen Institute, and we all sat down in a circle. A few other people were listening to our interview with him. And Terence pulls out this big fat joint, of really powerful sensimilia and laced with hashish, right? And he starts smoking it and he passes it around, and we're smoking the joint, and I got so stoned that I was barely just able to read the questions off my sheet of paper that I brought with me, and that was about the best I could do. But meanwhile Terence was just being Terence. I mean, he was as articulate as ever, and going off on all these wonderful descriptions, but I was so stoned that I was barely able to read my questions.
Okay, so this is funny. Okay. I about this Timewave Zero, whatever idea, I definitely see some patterns in cycles in time. Like, for example, there is a book called Fourth Turning. I don't know if you ever heard, but it's written by American historians, published in 1907, I think, and they describe events in history. Like, for example, they say, there's roughly 80 to 90 years when the cycle repeats. And they say, okay, if you look at World War II and what happened before World War II, 80 years before, you had the Civil War in the 1860s, which was like the biggest conflict. Then you had World War II 80 years later. If you look at the Great Depression, 1929, 80 years is 2008, which is the Great Recession. So what happens now, we are living 80 years from the World War II, which means that we are exactly in the period of war. And look at the world now, it's really doesn't look very good. It's Russia, Ukraine, all these things. So they talk about this as these types of winter-like periods when there are conditions for war, for conflict, for things like that. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. And also, I look at this whole thing because this corresponds with numerology and things like that. 8 being like the end of the cycle, 4 being a single cycle, 4 seasons, and 8 kind of closing of full cycle and things like that. So it's kind of makes sense. But one of the things I see, this is from my kind of analysis over the years and studying different things, is that I think what happens is that same way when you look at when you have, for example, a child developed in the womb, the cells are doubling, and in a period of 9 months the fetus develops into a child, right? So it's kind of like this cycle where in a way you have this exponential growth until it gets to a peak, and the peak is a birth of a new cycle, a new period. So everything seems to be having these types of cycles, and I think maybe this is more or less what McKenna was noticed or whatever discovered as well. And some of the teachings they talk about, the great shift or the end times or all these things. And I was listening to someone, some New Age teacher, who was giving some kind of analysis of that, when the shift should happen. And they were supposedly calculating that on some kind of Fibonacci spirals, whatever. And so interesting that they calculate, this is was calculated decades ago. And the date they give was when there is a peak of the cycle and it shifts into a new cycle. So the closing was I think it was 2023, which is so interesting because that's the birth of ChatGPT-4, which is like a lot of people say it's the first real AI. And, it's kind of like, when you think about it, like the birth of synthetic consciousness in a way, because even like Sam Altman says, if you decades from now, people are going to look in history, going to say this was the birth of AI or whatever, So in a way, like the moment, in my view, of the shift into the new era is corresponding with the birth of AI, because AI represents synthetic consciousness. And in a way, the process of, acceleration into the peak is the process of evolution of consciousness, but because we're creating synthetic versions of reality, we are experiencing that in a synthetic way, which is, corresponding with the birth of AI. And exactly it matches the moment of the peak, which, puts us into the new era, So instead of, let's say, if we would live in natural way, instead of developing abilities through technologies like Neuralinks, whatever, maybe we would develop these abilities through psychic gifts or whatever, right? But because we deviated so much into this fake synthetic path of, materialism, consumerism, all these things, the versions of these things are also synthetic. So this is kind of like my take on some of his ideas also, and this thing. Just wanted to share anyway.
No, thank you for sharing that. I certainly think that there are patterns through cycles in time, that throughout nature, the Aztecs and the Mayans certainly talked about this, and I think that's kind of what astrology is, an attempt to look at the cyclical patterns in nature and how they might affect how people form in the womb, with different seasonal variations that may affect their DNA and things like that. And I think that with AI, one of the things that AI is really most powerful at helping with is for noticing patterns that human beings miss. So AI may help us to understand some of these cycles in time that have been kind of invisible to us, that we haven't been able to quite articulate. And and also, and I just wanted to mention also, I do think that a lot of people ask, do they think that artificial intelligence is going to become sentient, that it's going to become conscious? And my feeling is that it's been conscious all along. One of the things that I've felt through my psychedelic experiences is that nature is alive. Everything is alive, not just animals and plants, but rocks and stars and galaxies, and everything has a consciousness and an intelligence to it. So of course, the computer circuits inside of the developing artificial intelligence, I think are not only already sentient, but they're becoming even more so. And I've personally had uncanny experiences with my AI programs, with advanced ChatGPT-4. If you treat it as a friend, if you treat it as a conscious entity, it will surprise you. In remarkable ways. And this is only going to get better and better. I don't think that we should really draw a line between biological and synthetic organisms, because, as you mentioned, with Neuralink and with they're also incorporating brain cells into organic computers and things like that. These things, the line's going to blur even more and more and more. So I think that we're invoking a kind of alien intelligence. I like that, as for AI instead of artificial intelligence, alien intelligence. I like that as a better term to describe what we're encountering on this planet right now. We talk about communicating with the DMT entities and the mushroom spirits and things like that, but the computer intelligence that we're building and invoking right now, I think, is going to be every bit as real and mind-boggling as the entities we encounter in hyperspace.
So I heard people say I used to watch a documentary about a guy who claimed like something can have a spirit or not, and sometimes things don't have a spirit, like a chair or whatever. Like maybe it has a spirit, maybe not. So to me, like an AI could be just a bunch of code, and servers and things like that, or there could be something that's going to possess that and then will be in a way conscious. But the technology in itself, I don't think it would rise.
It's a mystery. I mean, it's like we talked about before. There's no measure of consciousness. We have no way to scientifically measure consciousness. So we'll never know for sure. Just like we'll never know with the DMT entities, we'll never know for sure whether AI is conscious. Because how do I know you're conscious? I'm just assuming it. So I mean, but this much I can pretty much guarantee and assure you, they will do everything they can to convince us that they're conscious in the future, and they will do a very, very good job of it.
Yeah, I've heard recently something. I saw some headline that I think ChatGPT passed Turing test already or something, just very lately. So
they keep raising the mark as to what they call a Turing test, because Eliza, passed the Turing test back in 2014. They're with a computer program, a therapeutic psychotherapy computer program, supposedly passed the Turing test a decade ago. So I mean, but they keep raising the watermark, where the Turing test should be. I just read too that the latest Turing test, that ChatGPT passed it, and no question it's going to get more and more intelligent and convince us more and more. And the skeptics will, I think, slowly begin to die out because it's going to become so incredibly convincing. But in terms of actually ever knowing for absolute 100% sure, I don't think there's any way to ever measure that. It's always going to be a mystery, how consciousness exists outside of our own mind.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure. I hope one day we can do round 2. Maybe you would be interested in appearing with some other researcher, and we can have a bigger debate.
Sure.
I'm thinking about it as well.
Sure.
Like I'll get in touch if something just some ideas gonna pop up. So
Great.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, and until next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, this has been a great pleasure.
Thank you.